Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ed Belongia, who is the director of the Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Population Health at the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute, an adjunct professor of population health sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and former epidemic intelligence service officer at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Lastly, he currently leads a research team that conducts vaccine safety and effectiveness research in collaboration with the CDC, and has been interviewed and quoted by news organizations all over the country for his work. So, Dr. Belongia, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
So obviously it's a pretty relevant time to speak with an epidemiologist about the world and what's going on with COVID-19 and the pandemic. So just starting off to try to get an idea of how you first got involved in the field, what was your path to epidemiology?
Oh, that's a great question. My path to epidemiology was rather convoluted, actually. I was always interested in science, but I intended to become a physician when I went to college and ended up going to medical school at Michigan State. And at the time, I thought I was going to be a family physician. And I was very interested in holistic medicine and disease prevention in general. And then I did a residency in internal medicine at the University of Wisconsin. And during that experience, I spent about a month working on a research project, and I collaborated with some people at the state health department. And one person in particular was an injury epidemiologist. His name is Hank Weiss, and as an aside, he introduced me to my current wife, which was something else I'm be eternally grateful to him for. But working with Hank, I sort of discovered a whole different aspect of healthcare and public health that I wasn't really familiar with, and that was epidemiology.
Sure.
And I learned that there was another program called the Epidemic Intelligence Service that trained physicians as well as nurses and other professionals to become epidemiologists and work in public health. And at the time, I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do with my career, and I was finishing up my residency in Madison. I had been working in emergency departments as an emergency physician, and I was also a flight physician on UW Medflight helicopter service. So I was pretty well immersed in the emergency medicine world at the time, and I was trying to decide, do I want to do emergency medicine or do I want to do public health? And I sort of kept one foot in both worlds for a couple of years while I worked part-time at the state health department. I helped them launch their AIDS program. This was back in the 80s. And then, but I also was working on MedFlight at the same time in the emergency room. And then I applied to this CDC training program, the Epidemic Intelligence Service, or EIS. It sounds somewhat like this, like a counterintelligence agency, but it's really all about public health. It's, when it was started, it was started in the 1950s in sort of the era of biological warfare, and but it is strictly a public health training program. So I was really interested in sort of the public health side of things in terms of preventing diseases, rather than waiting until they show up in the emergency room and then trying to deal with it.
Right.
That's very important, but I was really sort of interested in sort of trying to get back more to the root causes. And so I applied to this two-year training program with CDC, and I was accepted. And that kind of changed my career and my whole career path from that point forward. I ended up spending my 2 years working with a top-notch team at the Minnesota Department of Health. I was fortunate to be involved in several very interesting investigations while I was there. And I was really hooked on, at that point, on public health and epidemiology. Right. And I stayed on there for a few years after that, and then came over to the Marshfield Clinic Research Institute to basically help develop a program in infectious disease epidemiology. And for the past 2 decades, we've been doing heavily focused on vaccines and vaccine research.
Yeah, so what particular type of vaccines are you working on? What diseases are you trying to combat?
Well, we have a major focus on respiratory viruses, and that includes influenza, obviously.
Yeah.
And for the past 14 months, it has included SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID-19. We also have done some work in another respiratory virus that is an important cause of disease in children and older adults. It's called RSV.
Hmm.
And that's a somewhat neglected virus in adults where not much attention is paid to it, but it's an important virus. And for 20 years now, we have been involved in looking at the safety of vaccines for all types of vaccines
Yeah.
with a network called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. So our focus has been really on vaccine effectiveness and influenza in particular, and then sort of another focus on vaccine safety in general.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting that I'm curious to know sort of your perspective on is as an epidemiologist, as someone who's kind of there on the front lines of research, um, what was your initial reaction when you heard about, the possibility of like a COVID pandemic occurring going back, over a year ago now? What was going through your mind? Because I imagine that this is, kind of one of the things that maybe you envision in your profession, but not necessarily, expect.
Yeah, it's interesting because a year before the pandemic, in the winter of 19, I think it was in February of 19, we have a group here called Science on Tap, where scientists give talks to the general public on
Ah,
topics of interest.
yeah.
And in 2018 was the 100-year anniversary of the great influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918. And so I gave a talk about that and talked about the pandemic, how bad it was in 1918, how we've never not seen anything like that, and how unprepared we were for another pandemic
Yeah.
of similar severity. Um, and one of my, I think, closing points was it could happen at any time. And I didn't know anything about coronavirus at the time and didn't mention that, but it was almost to a T a year later when we were reading these increasingly worrisome reports coming out of Wuhan and what was going on with the virus. And I know back in late January of 20, we were on vacation with some friends of ours. Actually, one of my supervisors from my EIS days in Minnesota is a good friend of mine, and she still works for the University of Minnesota. And we were vacationing, and she still works in epidemiology as well, and specifically on vaccine work. And we were just every day, we'd look at the latest headlines and wonder, how bad is this going to be? And we both thought it was going to be quite bad.
Yeah.
But I didn't, I think it exceeded my expectations, really. I mean, I knew that there would be some restriction of travel and it would certainly affect life throughout the world. But it has gone on longer, and the effects have been far more profound than I think I really anticipated.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of scary because I mean obviously this is your profession, so if this is more than you expected, just all the people that really have no idea about what goes on in this part of science, are just wow, this is crazy. um, really movie-like, to be honest, in the kind of the time that we've been living in. So when
Yeah,
it
yeah,
comes,
it was really it was interesting too because it's one thing to have plans for a pandemic, and then it's another thing to face the reality of it in
yes,
terms of how decisions are made or not made, and who follows them, and what the public messaging is, and are the political leaders on board or not.
right,
So
all
many
the
different
yeah,
aspects.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a complicated process to get a whole country moving in the right direction to fight off something like that, or the world in general, I suppose. So now, when it comes to your work with vaccines, from your perspective and from your experience, how efficient is vaccine research? Obviously, people seem to be pretty freaked out, mostly probably because of the moment that they're living in about vaccines and just the fact that we're living in a world where we're hearing about vaccines all the time, when in most cases in the past, I think more people were not really thinking much about getting vaccinated. It was something that we just do. So just talk a little bit about maybe your experience with vaccines and their safety and effectiveness.
Yeah, well, I think COVID has made vaccines much more high profile than they were prior to COVID. But even before COVID, it was always a challenge to motivate people to get the flu vaccine,
Yes. Yeah.
and it still is. And people had all sorts of reasons for not wanting to get the flu vaccine, and we can talk about the anti-vaccine movement if at some point if you want to sort of go down that thread. But I think in general, it's been an amazing amount of technological development in terms of vaccines in the past 20 or 30 years. And I think most people don't realize that. And obviously, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So it used to be the case that vaccines were fairly straightforward. Essentially, you take whatever the bug is that you want to vaccinate with, you kill it, you break it up, and you inject it and wait for the body's immune response to develop antibodies. And now it's far more sophisticated, where they have really structure-based design. They understand the molecular structure of the molecules. They understand exactly how the immune system is going to respond to those molecules, and they can design the molecules to develop the most effective immune response. And so we now have a variety of vaccines, a large variety of vaccines against many different pathogens, but they're largely underutilized, I think, because the public doesn't understand how effective and safe they are. And I think there's a lot of misinformation and lack of awareness of the rigorous level of testing that these vaccines undergo, both before they're licensed as well as after licensure in terms of monitoring and in terms of safety monitoring as well. And it might be helpful just to sort of briefly kind of walk through the process of sort of how a vaccine goes from a concept to putting it in someone's arm at Walgreens.
Yeah, sure.
The first step with vaccines is they do what they call preclinical testing, where they test the vaccines in animals for safety and to see if they seem to generate the type of immune response in animals that we're looking for. And so a lot of vaccines never make it beyond that point. If they make it beyond that point, then the company has to file for an investigational new drug application with the FDA. So they have to get approval to then test this vaccine in humans. And the FDA monitors the process along the entire way with a high level of sort of scrutiny and scientific rigor. In what's called phase 1 of the clinical trials, the vaccine is tested in a small number of people, primarily for safety and to see if there's any evidence of an immune response. And so it has to pass that bar before they move on to the next phase, which is called phase 2.
Right.
And that's where they tested in a larger number of people, maybe a few hundred people, to see if the vaccine is generating an immune response, generally an antibody response, that would indicate that it may be helpful or effective, and also to verify the safety. So safety is a concern all the way through. And there are well-established FDA requirements to look at both long-term safety or short-term safety and long-term safety out to at least 6 months or more.
Yeah.
And then if the vaccine passes the phase 2 trial, then it can move into phase 3, which is the phase that would ultimately lead to licensure. And that's conducted in generally thousands of people. In many of the COVID trials, there were 30 or 40,000 people in those phase 3 trials. And the randomized trials so that people don't know if they're getting the vaccine or they're getting a placebo. So that eliminates a lot of potential sources of bias. And in those phase 3 trials, then the goal is to actually show that the vaccine protects people against the disease that it's intended to prevent. And and of course safety as well, because when you look at thousands of people, you can find things that you might not find when you're looking at only a few dozen. And then if it passes that bar, then the manufacturer again submits an application to the FDA for licensure. And again, the FDA just doesn't take the manufacturer's word for it. They have to submit all of the raw data to the FDA, and it is independently reanalyzed by FDA scientists to confirm the findings. And again, I'm really sort of focusing on this because I think over the past year with COVID, this became so politicized and people became
Yes.
skeptical
Yep.
of, is this all just politics? Are they just pushing this? And I've known scientists at the FDA and CDC for all of my career, and they are very well trained, rigorous scientists of the highest integrity, and they are doing a very careful and thorough job evaluating the safety and effectiveness of these vaccines. And so, anyway, ultimately that leads to licensure of the vaccine, and then it can be used in the general population for which it's approved. But the monitoring continues even after it's licensed. And then there are a number of monitoring systems that kick in after licensure to see how the vaccine is working in the real world. Is it as effective as we hoped? Some generally in the real world, things don't work quite as well as they do in clinical trials because things aren't as clean.
Right.
And again, with safety, when you start giving it to millions of people, you may find safety things that you didn't find when you only gave it to 15 or 30,000 people. And so that post-licensure monitoring also is a very important part of the assessment, and that's monitored by both the FDA and CDC. So that's sort of the overall sort of process. And I guess just as sort of a sidebar, sort of relating it to COVID, is what's called the Emergency Use Authorization.
Yes. Yeah. Another controversial thing now all of a sudden.
Right, and again, that's been a source of misconception, I think, too,
Yep.
where we hear concerns from people who are distrustful of the vaccine. They think the vaccines were rushed without being fully tested, and they say, well, they're only for emergency use. Where's the emergency? And the Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, is sort of another backdoor that allows the FDA to evaluate the safety and efficacy of a vaccine more quickly in an urgent public health crisis situation. But it does not cut corners. It cuts time, it cuts bureaucracy. For example, there are aspects of the licensing process that just cannot be compressed in time. They just take a long time to complete, and that includes things like all the quality assurance steps for the manufacturing process and actual inspection of the manufacturing facilities, for example.
Yeah.
That's not required for the emergency authorization. But the emergency authorization did require them to show that the vaccine had a minimum of 50% efficacy. And actually, they blew away that bar by getting 95% efficacy
Right.
for the mRNA vaccines. And they had very specific standards in terms of safety and a minimum requirement of 8 weeks of safety follow-up. For a licensed vaccine, they would generally look at least 6 months of safety follow-up. But we know from having done vaccine safety work for a long time that any vaccine-related problems that are going to occur will almost always pop up within the first 8 weeks after you get the vaccine. So you're not going to find anything after 8 weeks that wasn't apparent during the first 8 weeks. And so
Right.
while it would be certainly sort of better to follow 6 months, 6 months is always better than 8 weeks. I think it was very reasonable and have a high degree of confidence that a vaccine that is safe at 8 weeks is going to be safe. But of course, we and they are continuing to follow people and accrue longer term safety data. But in the setting of hundreds of thousands of people dying from COVID, makes perfect sense to use the vaccine if we know that we have safety data for 8 weeks and
Yeah.
very high efficacy for preventing COVID.
So ultimately, for people listening to this, that this represents, when you say you need to have something there for an emergency, this is really and just a more efficient process to get something out quicker because people need it because people are dying. it's not they're not skipping any steps. This is just a better way of doing things that's designated for emergencies, but the same process overall, just less bureaucracy, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. And there were three things in particular that they did in order to try and speed up the process of assessing these vaccines and getting them out to people. One is that the vaccine development actually built on a body of knowledge that was gained after the original SARS outbreak, which was in 2003. And so at that time, we learned a lot about the immune response to SARS, because the current virus, SARS-CoV-2, is very, very close to the original SARS in 2003.
Right.
So from 2003, we understood we understood the structure of the virus. We understood what about the virus triggers an immune response and how that works. And actually, there were candidate vaccines being developed in animals after SARS back in the 2000s that never actually came to human studies, but in animals they were being tested. And then because SARS was eradicated back in 2003 and didn't come back anytime soon after that, that work came to a halt. But there was a lot learned about the immunology. So there was that body of knowledge to build on for developing the vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. The other thing is the mRNA technology in particular had been worked on for 2 decades. And in fact, goes all the way back to investigators at the University of Wisconsin in the early 1990s, showing that you could inject mRNA and you could get those cells to produce proteins. And that led to some investigators working on this in the 1990s and late 1990s and 2000s, doing basic science research that was not very much appreciated at the time. And in fact, some of the investigators doing that were demoted, and it was, and the funding was hard to get, and it seemed to be a backwater going nowhere. And now I wouldn't be surprised if some of those investigators get Nobel Prizes.
Wow.
But the mRNA technology turned out to be tremendously successful, and there was proof of concept even before the COVID-19 pandemic came around. They were testing mRNA vaccines for other viruses like Zika, for example, and showing proof of concept that you could actually do this and it would generate an immune response in people. So there was a body of knowledge already existing. It's not like we were starting from scratch with COVID-19. That was one piece. The second piece was that instead of going through the sequential process of clinical trials that I described a little while ago, they compressed those into a shorter timeline. For example, normally a company would do a phase 2 trial, they would stop, they would evaluate it, look at the results very carefully, and decide if they want to invest money in a phase 3 trial. In this case, it was compressed, and phase 2 and phase 3, for example, were put together into a single study, shorten the timeline. And then the last thing that's very important, I think, was that unlike the normal situation where the company developing the vaccine basically takes all the risk, the financial risk of developing it, in this case, the U.S. government, with Operation Warp Speed, provided basically financial support to begin manufacturing these vaccines even before the trials were completed. So there was a possibility that they were manufacturing vaccines that would never be used if they were not effective in the clinical trials or safe. But the only way to speed that up would be to begin the manufacturing at the same time the trials were going on. And the U.S. government basically provided the financial guarantee to support that and allowed that to happen, so that basically as soon as the Pfizer vaccine was authorized, they were shipping vaccine the next week to put in people's arms.
Right. I mean, so all the pieces were there. I mean, it's not surprising that we've gotten to this point with vaccines. Which I think is really important for people to understand, obviously, given the situation and all the misinformation out there about the process and how it went about. So, so that makes me think then, I would like to get into more about sort of your take on how things are going with vaccinations, as well as what may occur in the future. I'm curious, though, just on a side note, given your position and just given your occupation, have you had any interactions with people that were sort of anti-vax at all that just kind of popped up, or I don't know, or have you been able to dodge some of that? I'm just curious to see what, especially during a pandemic, if people in your position have sort of been harassed at all, or sort of had some interesting situations given everything going on.
No, I haven't been harassed, but we certainly do hear either directly or indirectly about concerns that people
Yeah.
have. And we're in a rural part of Wisconsin. We're a large healthcare system, and but we cover pretty much all of the northern half of Wisconsin, or northern and western half. And so we cover a lot of rural areas where it's very clear that vaccine uptake is lagging in rural areas. There's more
Yeah.
vaccine skepticism in rural areas. It's been politicized. And so, we hear about that. And there was a survey, I believe Hospital Administrators, that was publicized a few weeks ago, where they were saying that there is still a lot of vaccine resistance, even among employees in a lot of rural hospitals.
Wow.
And even in our own healthcare system, we have many who have not yet been vaccinated. Almost all the physicians have, but among other employees, there are people who are still reluctant. And it's not unique to our healthcare system. It's a general phenomenon, I think, throughout large parts of rural America. And I also happen to have, one friend who occasionally sends me things that he finds on the internet and
Oh
asks for
gosh.
my opinion.
Yeah.
And he sends me stuff that I never would have seen, and
Yeah.
I appreciate the fact that he trusts me enough to sort of allow me to debunk it. But everything from microchips
Yeah.
to the fact, the suspicion that somebody patented this virus even before the pandemic because it was all, it was sort of designed to deliberately cause the pandemic so that companies could make a lot of money selling vaccines to stop it, and
Yeah.
other conspiracy theories kind of like that. And or another one that I received from this person, and I think this is a fairly common misconception, is someone going through data that you can pick up online from the government, from something called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, where people can report anything that happens after a vaccine that's bad. If someone dies after a vaccine and you think it was
Yeah.
related, you can report it. And so, in this YouTube video, the person is sort of going through this saying, look, there are all these thousands of deaths. The vaccine has killed thousands of people because look at all these reports. And, it's just a fundamental sort of lack of understanding of how epidemiology works, and the
Yeah.
fact that correlation does not equal causation.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And the fact that something reported that something happened after a vaccine doesn't mean that the vaccine caused what you just reported, and that
Right.
you need to, use studies to sort of look at whether the rate was higher than what you would expect by chance. But not everybody sort of, dives into it in that level of detail. And so if you're not thinking about that and you just watch this video, you go, oh yeah, there's 8,000 people have died after getting the vaccine. What's going on here? And so we're constantly battling that kind of misinformation, and it's almost an impossible task with social media because it has a life of its own.
Yeah. Social media, I think, in the 21st century has really become a great educational resource and also a monster for wreaking havoc and spreading just false information. That's definitely a double-edged sword for sure, especially in your field. And I think really in many fields, I know, just thinking about history in general, I mean, the amount of pseudo history that exists on the internet is, pretty popular. So a lot of people are interested in, for example, like, History Channel things about various, superstitious type beliefs and like ancient aliens, building pyramids or whatever. So it seems like it's hitting a lot of fields pretty hard lately. And just thinking about when you bring up people having access to different tools online, thinking from a sort of a historical perspective, I imagine if someone was really trying to cover up something like that, it wouldn't be hard to, if you're living in a country that was a little bit more authoritarian, they wouldn't allow for people to even access things like that if they're really trying to hide something. So I do find that kind of interesting when people talk about, oh, look at these things I found. And I think that if someone was trying to hide something, you wouldn't be seeing them. But the thing is that people aren't trying to hide stuff. So just
Well, I think that that's the irony of it is that there's so much misinformation out there, sort of suggesting that there's a cover up, there's a
yeah,
conspiracy. The
yeah,
government doesn't want you to know
right,
what's really happening, and yet, if you actually look at what's happening, the government is very rigorous in terms of monitoring safety and being transparent. And I think a really good example of that is the recent publicity a few weeks ago of these rare blood clots occurring in
yes,
people who get the Janssen vaccine, mainly in young women under 50. That was picked up through the safety monitoring system, the VAERS system. But importantly, the VAERS system, which is just based on case reports, doesn't actually prove that those blood clots were in fact caused by the vaccine.
yeah,
But we have other monitoring systems in place, and we looked at those other monitoring systems, and in fact there was a substantially increased risk in women who got the Janssen vaccine, and we didn't see that with people who got the mRNA vaccines by Pfizer and Moderna.
sure,
So, and that was discussed in a public forum by a CDC advisory panel. Anybody could watch their debate on this and their thinking on it, and why they came to the conclusion that that women should be informed of this risk, but it was a very rare side effect, and the risk of COVID-19 itself, which can cause blood clots, is far greater than the risk of the vaccine. But there's transparency, and women should know about the risk, and they can anyone can certainly make an informed choice if they don't want to get that
right,
vaccine. But the assessment of the advisory panel was that we should keep using this vaccine. We should not stop using it,
right.
but we should make sure people are informed. So the whole process was very transparent, and I think very should be reassuring to the public that in fact the vaccine safety system is working well in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think that one thing everyone should be really appreciative of is just that they're, epidemiologists and medical experts like you that are out there just willing to, be open and talk and share your knowledge with people about the system and how it works and be transparent about it. Because I think in the long run, I know people in other countries like Russia, for example, where there's a long history of government, sort of suppression of information. And the numbers of people that are vaccine hesitant in former Soviet states is humongous. I mean, it's just
Really?
out of control, way more than here. Where when I talk to people in Russia, for example, basically I'm hearing that almost nobody wants to get the vaccine. Same thing with places in Uzbekistan, all over the former Soviet world, people are incredibly hesitant and afraid, mostly because there's this long history of sort of the Soviet suppression of information, and people just don't trust governments much. So I think that's a
Yeah,
big advantage we have here, is that we can be open. So
I think that is a big advantage, and I completely agree that I think it is important that scientists talk about their work. And I know for some scientists that's not something that comes naturally, and a lot of scientists just want to sort of talk to their peers or colleagues and publish things. But it's especially when you're doing research in an area that has implications for public health and public policy, it's very important to help translate that for the general public, because much of what we do requires someone to help translate it, and it needs to be done in a very objective, unbiased, non-political way. And we really need to undo the damage from last year and really try and separate public health from politics. And I think it's very important to try and tailor the messages to the audience, to make it relevant to the audience, and focus on what we know, and be open and honest about what we don't know, what we're not clear about. And also, I think, to really talk a little bit about the people who are doing this work, and their commitment to their families, their communities, and their country. Because again, I think, there's a lot of people in government and in industry too they're really trying to do the right thing to protect people. But I think it's hard for the general public to really know what's going on because they don't see that. They don't
Yeah.
have any of the details.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thinking forward, do you think there's going to be a need to have a COVID vaccine every year as like sort of a booster, or kind of like the flu shot, maybe, where you have a seasonal vaccine? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. Don't think we know the answer to that
yeah,
quite yet. It is encouraging that so far what we're seeing with these variant strains from South Africa, the UK strain, which is now becoming dominant in the US as well, that's the B117 strain, the Brazil strain as well. The vaccine appears to provide good protection against those variant strains. And the vaccine was developed against the original strain. So there appears to be cross protection, and it appears to hold for protecting against serious illness like hospitalization. So that's good news. But we will need to continue to monitor to see if strains emerge that perhaps the vaccines do not protect as well against. And I know there are studies, clinical trials underway right now looking at a boost with the original vaccine, as well as a boost with a new vaccine that specifically targets one of the variant viruses. As well as there's a study starting up to look at a vaccine that actually contains two different strains in the same vaccine. That's getting a little more like the flu vaccine, where the current flu vaccines contain 4 different flu vaccine strains. And there's no reason why something like that couldn't also be done for COVID if we need to. In terms of whether you need to get it every year, again, hard to say. We don't have enough time yet to really answer that question, but it is quite encouraging that at least out to 6 months, we're not seeing any drop off in protection. And so I think it's quite possible that people will have protection for several years unless there's some new variant strain that emerges that requires an update to the vaccine strain. But in terms of just the protection from the original vaccine, it may well last longer than a year. I don't think it's necessarily going to be an annual vaccine, but it could be. I think over the next 12 months, we'll know a lot more about that.
yeah, okay, that makes sense. Obviously, it's always a process when it comes to figuring out these things. Now, speaking just as sort of the U.S. in general, when it comes to the latest new mask guideline, what do you make of that decision? Obviously, I guess there's been some critique that it's just going to encourage a lot of people who are not vaccinated to not wear masks. What's your sense of how this might play out?
Well, I think CDC made the right decision. I think the science does in fact support that now. We know much more now than we knew 3 or 4 months ago, and we know that if you're vaccinated, the vaccine is protecting you against infection, and it's greatly reducing the possibility that you will become infected and spread it to someone else. And so from that sense, if you're vaccinated, you're not going to be contributing in any meaningful way to the spread of the virus, and you're going to be well protected yourself. Vaccinated people can relax and get back closer to a normal life. I think the problem arose because I think CDC's decision seemed like a dramatic 180-degree reversal, and nobody saw it coming. And in particular, employers. We'd seen some stories about employers who were planning on mask requirements in workplaces, and the CDC change kind of created some chaos there in terms of how that's going to play out. And so I think there will be some challenges going forward in terms of specific situations. Essentially, I think over most of the past year, the message has been we're all in this together. We need to mask, we need to social distance to protect everybody else. And now with this new CDC recommendation, we've sort of split into two groups. And there was a nice essay online by Peter Sandman and Jody Lannard, and I'm sort of paraphrasing some of the points they made, that these are really their points. But essentially now, instead of we're all in this together, it's like we have two groups. We have the vaccinated people. They're all okay. They're good to go. And we have the unvaccinated people. And we are rapidly approaching the point in many parts of the country where if you're unvaccinated, it's because you're choosing to be unvaccinated. It's not because you can't get a vaccine. Certainly in our part of Wisconsin, vaccines are readily available if you want one. So it's really only children under 12 who really can't get the vaccine at this point. Everybody else, if they want to get vaccinated, they can. And so the question is, if you're unvaccinated and choosing to be unvaccinated, well, you're making a decision and you're accepting a risk on your own. And if you're out in public and other people are unvaccinated, or other people are not wearing a mask, you don't know if those people are vaccinated or not, and you're potentially at risk. But at some point, people have to decide what level of risk they're comfortable with, and if they have access to a vaccine and they're choosing not to take one, that's a choice. I think the most difficult part of this from a public health standpoint in this situation are those people for whom the vaccine doesn't work. People who have compromised immune systems, for example, or children who can't get vaccinated because they don't have the option to get vaccinated, or it won't work very well for them, and they're relying on everybody else to protect them. And so if there are people out in public not wearing masks who are not vaccinated, they are putting other people at risk. And those people who have compromised immune systems are at particular risk. And children don't develop serious problems nearly as often as adults, but they also can develop serious illness after SARS-CoV-2 infection. So that's a downside, but from a big picture perspective, I think CDC made the right decision. I just think the messaging probably could have been done with a little more advanced warning.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. But you kind of remind me of just another thought then, because when you're thinking about people who are a little bit more conspiratorial, thinking about government cover-up, notice that the government is not trying to force anyone to get a vaccine. They're encouraging them, but they're not forcing anyone or trying to coerce anyone into getting one. So another thing that just shows that they're really being, everyone's being pretty laid back about not shoving vaccines down anyone's throat or something. It's just like we're trying to help people protect themselves and their families. So
right. And our society has a libertarian bent, right? We tend to emphasize personal freedoms and liberties. And so if we're at the point now where people who are at high risk everybody has had the opportunity to get a vaccine, then it doesn't surprise me at all that at this point, there'll be some proportion of the population that will choose not to get it. But I really think it's going to be very important to keep pushing and keep trying to educate people and promote the vaccine, because we need to get to higher levels of coverage to have more, population protection. And we're not there yet. In Israel, once they got over around 40 to 50% of the population fully vaccinated, their cases just plummeted. We're getting close to that. It's going to be important now when we're at the point where we have to sort of convince people to get the vaccine, whereas 3 months ago, people were desperate to get the vaccine, but those folks are all vaccinated now. And so the people now who are left are people who aren't that interested, or maybe it's not convenient for them. And so we need to make it really convenient. We need to give them access to the vaccine, and we need to address their concerns in order to sort of get to the next level. And that's going to be the challenge over the next 3 to 6 months.
It was fascinating for me to hear about recently in the news when they're talking about different states now having lotteries where they're offering money to people who get vaccinated, trying to come up with any idea possible. Please get vaccinated. Here, we'll give you $1 million. Just get vaccinated. It's fascinating just how things have unfolded. Really is.
Right. And here's what I would say to someone who says, I'm young and healthy. I'm not afraid of COVID. I'll take my chances. I don't trust the vaccine. It's new. I don't trust it, and that's fine. I understand if you're young and healthy and you're very low risk personally, but think about your family. Think about your grandparents. Think about all the people you interact with on a daily or weekly basis. And think about the possibility that you might unknowingly become the carrier that picks up this virus and spreads it to some person who's immune compromised, or some person who develops a serious complication. Even if you don't become sick, you will be part of that chain if you don't get vaccinated. If you get vaccinated, that won't happen. And so to sort of try and broaden the perspective a little bit, to think more than just whether I'm going to get very sick from COVID-19, but what about my family and my friends and my community, and how can I do my part to help protect them too?
Yeah, I think that's an important thing too, because I imagine for some people that are vaccine hesitant or just on the fence, they feel like, oh, I'm kind of just being fear mongered into trying to get a vaccine. Though I'm healthy, I'm fine. Well, there's a bigger picture here than just you. You're in a human society, lots of people, different circumstances and health complications, and others are more vulnerable than you are, perhaps. And that's something that we have to be aware of as well as part of society. So that's another good point. Turning, I guess, the corner here. One thing, I guess, perhaps people probably are not too excited to have to think about this just yet, but I thought having you on to be cool to ask your opinion. Obviously, historically, when it comes to pandemics, COVID-19 has been, a really bad one that we haven't seen in a long time. But historically, obviously, there's been pandemics that have killed a lot higher percentage of people. How concerned are you about the future of a pandemic that's even worse than COVID-19?
That's a good question. And yes, I'm very concerned about this. As bad as it was, it could have been worse with COVID-19. The case fatality rate for COVID-19 is less than what was the fatality rate for the 1918 flu. And then if you look at other avian flu viruses which have pandemic potential, like H5N1, H7N9, those kill 30 to 40% of the people who are infected. Imagine if you had a pandemic virus that killed 20 or 30% of people infected. That would destroy a modern society. And I hope that one of the lessons that we're learning from this is that, in fact, that could happen. This was a bad pandemic. We're going to get through it. But we learned where we're vulnerable. And we need to devote a lot more resources to having a robust public health infrastructure, as well as preparing for the next pandemic and how we're going to respond so we don't make the same mistakes we made with this one. And part of that, I think, is going to be sort of accelerated vaccine development and being able to have vaccines available very quickly after a potential pandemic virus is identified. And part of it is just going to be sort of the international response to an emerging threat, whether it starts in China or India or South America or right here in the United States.
Yeah, I imagine that vaccine funding and research for that should almost become like a military expenditure almost. When you think about you have to take it seriously like it's a military threat, because it's something that can wipe out your population way faster than a war possibly could. It's really dangerous. So
it is a national security threat, absolutely, and the economic damage it could do, as well as the human health damage, is really immense. And so I'm hopeful that there will be far more sort of attention paid to planning after this, and resources will be committed. The usual approach is that we have some bad thing happen and all of a sudden people throw money at it, But then after a couple of years, there are other political priorities, and
Yeah.
people forget about it, and they sort of move on to other things and forget about it, and then we go back to being unprepared again.
Yeah.
And with pandemics, we've pandemics occur on a not a predictable basis, but they do keep occurring. And this one has shown us that bad ones can occur. And so I think it's going to be really key that we develop more effective international coalitions to be prepared for the next pandemic. And also, I would just mention too that one of the things that has become clear from this pandemic is we do not have an effective global vaccine distribution system. There are many low and middle income countries that basically don't have vaccine and aren't going to have vaccine for a long time yet. And so we have to really have the capacity for global manufacturing to vaccinate the world, and not just the United States and Europe and the wealthier countries. And that's going to require a global commitment, and it's going to require resources to do that.
Yeah, a lot of people forget that this really crosses different boundaries we put up as different nations and countries, because these pandemics don't go away if other countries in the world are suffering from them. Also, I imagine can lead to new forms of the virus and stuff spread back to us. So it's best to stamp it out as quick as possible everywhere, I guess.
That's such a key point, because if the virus is spreading uncontrolled in other parts of the world, that's a threat to the entire world.
Yeah.
And that's where those new variants can emerge that may be resistant to vaccines. And so we need to protect people around the entire world. And we don't currently have an effective mechanism to do that. Now, there's been some press recently about the issue of removing patent rights in order to allow other countries to manufacture vaccines, such as the mRNA vaccine. But that's only one small piece of it, because it's not easy to manufacture these vaccines. And even if you remove the patent rights, you have to train people and build the manufacturing facilities and do what's called technology transfer. That takes time and resources. That's not easy to do. And so that's where we need to sort of plan before the pandemic to make sure we have the capacity and the expertise in place to meet a global need for a new vaccine. And we certainly don't now. There's a group called COVAX that has had a stated goal of distributing, I think, around 2 billion doses to low and middle income countries. And they only have been able to do a small fraction of that because they have not had very much funding.
Okay.
And they're relying on the wealthier countries to be able to contribute to that. And so, again, that's a discussion I think we have to have to do better next time, because we're certainly not doing a very good job of getting vaccine out to the world.
Yeah, that's, I guess, be key for fighting future pandemics as well as this one. And hopefully people become more aware of the situation going forward, because this is not a problem that's going to go away. We're going to continue to have issues with different viruses, and something to always keep in mind. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk with me, and everyone listening to this, I'm sure will find this pretty interesting and informative, hopefully. How can people keep up with your work?
We have a website, Marshfield Clinic Research Institute. You can Google that. And I'm also on Twitter. I don't actually remember my Twitter handle, but
I'll share it. I'll share it for you. Don't worry.
Okay. And I don't tweet every day. I sort of sporadically when I find something new or interesting, but don't rely on me to provide something every day to look at. But I have found Twitter actually to be a really remarkably helpful source of information. There's some really great scientists on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I follow them. And if you want to sort of find out the latest things the thinking that's going on among epidemiologists and public health professionals, find the right people on Twitter and follow them. And it's a great resource.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.